Hi, good morning or good afternoon. Welcome to the security requirements of GLBA's new safeguards rule. Your questions answered. I'm Scott Giordano. I am General Counsel and Vice President of Corporate Privacy at Spiran. And so this hour, we're going to talk about all things GLBA in terms of the updates to the safeguards rule. If you have questions, please do send them in. I love getting questions and I love answering your questions. So a little bit about me. I am our General Counsel, also been involved with information security and privacy since 2003. So spent a lot of time involved in this space, and it's a new, really a new job every day. There's so much change in this area, and so very delighted to present this update on GLBA to all of you. So if you leave with nothing else, I'd like you to leave with a couple things here. So this change, the December 2021 updates that happened last year to the safeguards rule, it really represents the biggest change to the rules since 2003. And we'll talk about all the whys and wherefores of that. The updates, in my view, really represent table stakes for any kind of InfoSec program in the financial services sector. And I know we have folks from depository institutions on this presentation and folks from non-depository institutions. So it applies equally to both of you in many ways. And so we're going to talk about that. But the net of it is it really is table stakes from this point forward. These updates were issued on December 9th of last year. There were a couple early mandates, and I will talk about why I think there were early mandates at all. And the rest of the mandates are going to go live this December 6th. So very close, in fact, 60 days away. So what I'm not going to do is go into a very granular distinction between what the rules were and what they are now, or between this and Part 500, or between this and FFIEC. So if you want me to do that, send me an email. If I get enough emails, I will do an entire session just on the granularities of this versus all those aforementioned things. So let's get right to it. So before I get into the law itself, I want to give you a bit of a perspective on data privacy just over the past 30, 40 years. Because in my view, and I think this is an important distinction, there's really two big eras of privacy that we've had here in the United States and around the world. There is everything that happened before Edward Snowden, and there's everything that happened after Edward Snowden. So, and you may think that's a strange distinction, but here's why. Way before Edward Snowden, we had a very sectoral, still have a very sectoral approach to privacy and security here in the US. So you have things like HIPAA, which came out 1996. We have GLBA 1999, again, addressing very specific sectors. We have the privacy rule and the security rules that were promulgated thereafter. But again, these were very incremental, and they were very sector by sector, and they were primarily driven by security or by very limited privacy rights. I know that we call them the privacy rule in both cases, both HIPAA and GLBA, but as a practical matter, they didn't give a lot of rights to individuals. Yes, they protected their privacy ostensibly, but didn't really give you, the end user, a lot of rights like would be enjoyed under GDPR, for example. So fast forward now to 2013, where we had the Edward Snowden revelations. What was interesting about that is that had the effect of supercharging, if you will, the GDPR, which was under consideration at that time. It really gave it a lot more gravity, if you will, in terms of protecting personal information. And so when GDPR finally went online, which was in 2018, then you had, for example, California add the CCPA a month later, which borrowed in large measure from GDPR. And then, of course, other laws in the US and around the world borrowed from it as well. And so we have really come full circle now where what we're seeing, the changes in privacy and security reflecting GDPR and how that's been interpreted here in the US and elsewhere around the world. So it's a remarkable change, and it happened largely at the instigation of those revelations. Again, I don't know if that's necessarily a popular viewpoint of this, but I think that it's the correct one. So without further ado, questions, comments about anything I've spoken about thus far? Okay. In that case, then let's get right to GLBA. So I'm going to do a little bit of background. I'm not going to dig too deeply into it, just enough to get some context here. So GLBA, also known as the Financial Services Modernization Act of 1999, was signed in November 1999. So the idea, and this was a big deal back then, I remember it was to repeal Glass-Steagall, which was passed in the wake of the Great Depression. And the idea was that you would keep banks and other institutions from owning one another or having some kind of relationship that was damaging to the national economy. So that was the law for quite a while. That was changed. And part of that was the idea of addressing privacy and security. So they have this idea of non-public personal information, or NPI. And that's because we needed another acronym, and so we've got them. So we have NPI. That's what we'll be calling personal information or personal data in this presentation. So the privacy rule became enforceable on July 1st, 2001. You saw that, I think, in the timeline I just showed you. And then the safeguards rule, the security rule, essentially became enforceable May 23rd, 2003. So the changes we're talking about this hour are the biggest changes since that period. Okay. I'm going to really give you the big picture on the different kinds of enforcement responsibilities there are for the GLBA. And for those of you that are banking financial institutions, or you're under the auspices of the CFPB, I apologize in advance for really simplifying this or oversimplifying this. It is extraordinarily granular, but let me just give everyone the big picture. So for a banking institution, you have privacy addressed by the Consumer Financial Privacy Bureau, what's called Reg P, Regulation P. And then you also have the federal banking agencies have something called the Privacy Rule Handbook. So that addresses the privacy on depository institutions. On the security side, you have the interagency guidelines, and I'll talk about some enforcement of those in just a minute. But you have the interagency guidelines, and that is promulgated by the federal banking agencies. And you also have the CFPB also thinks that it has safeguards enforcements. I'll talk about that in a minute. For your non-depository institutions, which is, I imagine, the bulk of you on the call here, the FTC has the privacy rule. I talked about that. And then the safeguards rule. And that's really what the bulk of the discussion is going to be this hour. If you are a broker-dealer or investment firm, the SEC regulates you on Reg SP. Presumably that's security and privacy. I'll give you an example of how that applies. So a couple other things before we go on. Insurance companies also have, insurance companies have GLBA enforced against them by the state insurance commissioners, which I think is interesting. And then the state's attorneys general have enforcement capability of GLBA through this idea of concurrent jurisdiction. So this is an interesting dynamic in American law where we have federalism. That is to say, we have power sharing between the states and the federal government. This is an example where the states can enforce a federal law. And so in principle, states attorneys general can enforce GLBA as well. I'm not aware of any enforcement actions by them, but they can certainly do that. I mentioned earlier about CFPB. They've opined that they have the authority to punish purveyors of bad InfoSec as an unfair practice. And they just put together a memo and published this, I believe, back in May, essentially saying that they can enforce the safeguards rule, even though they specifically were not allowed to under Dodd-Frank. They were able to do so. I think it's a very interesting dynamic. I'm very curious why they decided they want to do that, but they say they can. Banking financial institutions, there's all kinds of regulatory institutions to govern banking. I'm not going to dig a lot into them because if you're an FI, you already know about this, but I just thought it was interesting how many different institutions can enforce GLBA. So let me give you a couple enforcement examples, as I think they're very poignant. So Capital One had a former Amazon Web Services engineer break in or exceed her authority that she already had when she was working on a project for Capital One, take your pick, and accessed all kinds of personal information and posted that to GitHub. So she was later arrested and prosecuted, and in fact today I believe there was a sentencing hearing, or sentencing was handed down for this person. So that happened. As a consequence, OCC, Office of the Controller of the Currency, fined Capital One $80 million, also implemented a consent order. And this is the more, in my view, the more important of the punishments, if you will. $80 million, admittedly, is a lot of money, but the consent order really is ordering the bank to implement better information security. And the problem is that that can take years and cost a fortune. And so in many ways, the consent order can be just as expensive as the sanction. And the source of the sanctions were the interagency guidelines. I mentioned those earlier. Those are used to enforce security by the banking, the depository regulatory authorities. Then we had Morgan Stanley. This one's very interesting. What Morgan Stanley did is they decommissioned a couple business units, and so they decommissioned all of the servers. And they did so by hiring, I'm not making this up, they hired a moving company to go and just grab all of this equipment and I presumably throw it away. But there was no degaussing or eliminating of all of the information on the servers. It was still there, it was still exposed. So not only did the OCC jump on them and fine them $60 million, offer a consent order, again, based on the interagency guidelines, but just recently, the SEC fined them $35 million and made a cease and desist order saying, stop doing this. And the root of that was Reg SP, there's the safeguards rule, and there's the secure disposals rule. So this is a great example of how both banking and non-banking, or depository and non-depository enforcement agencies work whenever there is an issue. Also, this does not include any of the civil litigation, any of the business partners that have sued, shareholders, derivatives, any of that. This is just straight up, just fines by the authorities. Again, I'm going to stop there. If there's questions or comments, send them in. And if there's not, then we will continue. I'm just going to do a quick check here. And I think we are good. Okay. So, talk about the early mandates. So, within 30 days of the issuance of the rules, so think about it, end of last year, essentially. A couple things that changed. One is that the definition of a financial institution was expanded. So it's an entity, is an FI, if it's engaged in an activity that's financial in nature or is incidental to such financial activities, as described in Section 4K of the Bank Holding Act. So also the activity of finders is brought under the ambit of this rule. And a finder is a company or a person that's bringing buyers and sellers together. So think about organizations that create marketplaces. They are now finders. And you might wonder, why is this the case? Why is the FTC bringing these folks in? My guess, and I think it's a good guess, is to incorporate the blockchain and the crypto folks, because there is still a lot of question about who is going to be governing them, under what rules. I think it's almost a given that the GLBA safeguards rule are going to be the default rule that blockchain, crypto, all those folks would be governed by, at least insofar as privacy and security. I believe that these two items here really inure to the benefit of the FTC to bring those folks in under their control. A couple other early mandates. So you have to have a written information security program. Presumably, you already have one, but it was something that was deemed important enough that they said within 30 days, you better put one together. I've never seen one put together in 30 days, but presumably, if you had to do it, you could. Also, they asked to periodically perform additional risk assessments that examine reasonably foreseeable internal and external risks. And they're asking that, again, to be done within 30 days. So essentially doing a supplemental risk assessment. And then they're also asking for to regularly test or otherwise monitor the effectiveness of your safeguards. So why these? I think largely it's because of this idea of ransomware being so prevalent, and the idea that they're asking you, those that are under the auspices of GLBA, to be able to double check to make sure you're ready to combat ransomware. That's my guess. I don't have insight into exactly what they were thinking, but this is my guess, is I think they were directing this towards ransomware. Talk about who's subject to the safeguards rule. I mentioned earlier about FIs, about depository institutions. You already know that. What's interesting is who is also subject to this under the FCC. So you have, under the FTC. So you have organizations you would expect would be subject to this. So a retailer that issues its own credit cards, dealerships that lease automobiles, etc., but also things you probably wouldn't expect. So a real estate appraiser, okay, career counselors that specialize in financial professionals, and so forth. So a lot of organizations are subject to the safeguards rule that you probably wouldn't expect. And it's very, very interesting. One of the things that I thought in particular that was noteworthy was this, again, this idea of finders. So we talked about this earlier, this idea of organizations that are involved in making markets of any kind. Not only is that directed towards the blockchain and the crypto folks, but I think any organization that is making a market of any kind is going to be subject to this. So again, this is a catch-all that the FTC has used to be able to grab as many organizations as possible under GLBA. So more on safeguards rules. So this idea of fintech, so companies that develop financial technology. So back in 2019, the FTC and a fintech company, which is called Lightyear Dealer Technologies, or Dealer-Built, got into a consent agreement, and it required Lightyear to establish and implement a comprehensive information security program. And I'm underlining that because, as I mentioned earlier, it's a very expensive, time-consuming, laborious process to put together a comprehensive information security program if you've never had one. And so this is what was asked of them. And it was because Dealer-Built essentially lost 12.5 million, the personal data of 12.5 million consumers. And they did so because they had the data unencrypted. It wasn't particularly well protected. And this was brought to their attention, to FTC's attention, and so a complaint ensued. And so I thought what was fascinating about this consent order is it required them to document an information security program, designate a qualified employee or employees to be responsible for it, employ encryption, conduct risk assessments yearly, and test and monitor. And you may say, why is this a big deal? This is a big deal because essentially the FTC is saying, okay, we want these very specific things to be done, and these things all wound up in, guess what, the updated GLBA. So none of this is an accident. Also, not just the GLBA, when we talk about the kind of regulatory authorities that a banking financial institution or something similar to it is going to be subject to. So if you're from a depository FI, you've already well versed with Part 500. For those of you that are not, what happened is back in 2017, and again, I think a lot of this was largely in response to just the epidemic of ransomware and other kinds of attacks. NYDFS promulgated 23 NYCRR Part 500. So this is cybersecurity requirements for FIs. And again, the idea of FIs is very large. It's not just traditional banks, but it's others as well. And it asked, not surprisingly, establish a cybersecurity program, appoint a qualified individual to lead it, implement controls, et cetera, et cetera. So not terribly surprising that these kind of things are being asked. And again, these apply to things, entities like mortgage brokers and insurance companies. The net of it is that GLB improvements, the updates really were modeled on this. They're not a one-for-one. And again, if you want me to do a one-for-one, I'm happy to do that at another webcast. But the net of it is that GLB really copied and pasted a lot of stuff from Part 500 into the updates. Also, those of you from the insurance sector, you know that Part 500 became the basis for the insurance data model security law, and that is the law, I believe, in 21 states as of the moment. Again, I'm going to pause there. If there's questions, if there's comments, send them in. I am happy to answer it. Let me do a quick check here. And I think we are good. Okay, so let us continue. So we'll talk about non-public personal information, NPI. So what's interesting about this is it has a different definition than you find with other laws, other regulations. Typically, other laws or regulations will have this idea of saying that any data that is reasonably linked to an identified or identifiable person is personal information. It tends to be very generic. They do a different take on it here. So it's information, so it's personally, so let me rewind here. It's personally identifiable financial information, which I'll do the next slide, and it's also any list, depiction, grouping, etc. that's derived using personally identifiable financial information. I'm highlighting that because, again, think about all the data analytics that are available out there. So you can find all kinds of technologies that can extract and infer personal information from information that you've already been given. That exactly is what they're addressing here when they talk about that is derived from personally identifiable financial information. So again, whenever you see things like that and wondering why they're making such a big deal about things that are derived, that's the exact reason. Also, personally identifiable financial information. What's interesting here is it's not just information that a consumer provides to you, the institution, about a financial product or service. It's anything about a consumer resulting from a transaction, or it's information you otherwise obtain from a consumer. Why am I highlighting that? Again, going back to this idea of analytics. So take a look at a transaction. What kind of analytics are behind that someone's going to be using, and what are they going to be inferring about you as a consequence? That now becomes NPI. And so at this point, you might ask, doesn't that mean that just about everything can be NPI? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Okay, some examples of NPI, so this in particular, personally identifiable financial information, and I want to draw your attention to item F. So they give some examples here, but I like item F in particular because it's talking about any information you collect through an internet cookie. And then they say parenthetically, the information collecting device from a web server. So what I think is interesting about that is that, yes, they say internet cookie, but what about a browser fingerprinting? Could they apparently